Hi. So, what exactly is moral distress and how does it relate to social work? So, moral distress was conceptualized in the field of nursing. Back in 1984, Andrew Jameson identified it as a situation where one knows the right thing to do, but is impaired from doing that by institutional constraints. So, look, moral distress is not something such as an ethical dilemma. It's not about choosing between two morally possible, acceptable options. Moral distress is when the social worker knows the right thing to do. That is, in their judgment, they are certain of the right thing to do, but that action is impaired. They are stopped from taking that action by the institutional or the organizational context. So, in terms of what is restricting or what is impairing that option, there is talk that it is to do with institutional constraints. So, for social workers, that may be the organization that they're working in, the policies, the practices, the ethos of that organization itself. It's also to do with the system and the socio political system and environment that, as social workers, we're practicing in this day and age. There is also a school of thought, though, that says that there may be internal constraints on how we can act on the judgments that we perceive are right. And these internal constraints might be to do with a lack of knowledge, a lack of skills, or some say a lack of moral conscience, a lack of willingness to take that action. So, how does moral distress actually come into play in social work? What I have found is that it is to do with the times when we are very clear about an action that should be taken. In many cases, this action is related to services or the well-being of a client. But due to systems, organizational constraints, be they funding, be they staffing, be they to do with the values of the organization, that action is prohibited and is unable to be taken by the individual worker. So, in my experience, an example that I can draw on is a point that I now can term in the context of moral distress. Previously, it was something that I identified as a crossing of the line, a point of no return. And for me, the value that was the ethical value that was in play was that of equity. And the situation was with regarding services for programs, where one program was serving an Indigenous Aboriginal population and another program was serving a general mainstream community population. Both were providing the same, were under the same banner and meant to be providing the same service. However, the funding for the Indigenous program was less, and therefore the capacity to offer the clients in that program the services that they needed, which were being already offered to clients in the non-Indigenous program, was prohibited, was restricted. The organization's funding model and resource capacity did not allow that to happen. Now, for me, this was something that I battled with and I actually felt was, looking at it in hindsight, an example of moral distress. How moral distress turns into an effect or an impact on the social worker or the practitioner is really also coined into a term called moral residue. This is when there is a lingering impact of the moral distress situation which continues to fester as unresolved. So in my case, it was seeing and working with practitioners and clients who were being serviced by the Indigenous program and knowing and witnessing that they were receiving less services and less practice than the non-Indigenous clients. So what we find is that moral distress actually has to have two elements. It has to have a situation where the social worker is clear on the right action to take, but is impaired from taking that action due to institutional constraints. It also then has to have a physiological or psychological impact on the worker. And they can be such things as guilt, resentment, anger, which come around that situation of moral distress. as we say, with moral residue, that is the continuing festering of those physical and psychological symptoms as a result of the unresolved moral distress. I believe that moral distress is a concept that can be well applied to the social work setting. And my interest is not necessarily in quantifying who is at risk of moral distress, but more as using it as a reflective model, a reflective tool for looking at how we are impacted by the decisions and the inability to make decisions, the restrictions on our moral agency that we as practitioners experience. Thank you.